Okay, well, hello everyone. I wanted to give it an extra minute there just to let people get in and get settled. But my name is Eric. I will be leading this session and I'll introduce myself in just a moment. But I'm from the Autism Society of Minnesota. We are a nonprofit located right in between Minneapolis and St. Paul off of University and 280 in the heart of the Twin Cities. And so if you are not familiar with us, we go by our acronym AUSM or AWESOM for short, and we kind of run that into the ground. We're not afraid to do so. But as I let everyone else in, to share a little more about myself, prior to my role as the education director at AWESOM, I worked in special education, primarily middle school and high school students on the autism spectrum. And you see me here in the middle. A lot of our programs got canceled this summer. Unfortunately, our camps, which are kind of a highlight of the year, etc. So as everyone is, we are trying to adapt to COVID, but you see here on the right-hand side of the screen, primarily some of our outdoor activities, outdoor adventures, are some of the things we were able to do in smaller groups this summer. So you see a few of the fun outings we had. On the left-hand side then, I'm also a parent. I have two young boys, a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old. My older just started 2nd grade and he is currently distance learning or virtual, however you want to refer to it. And there are plans potentially within the next month or so to look at going back to school in person. But as we know, that is something that always is up in the air one way or another. So let me just let one more person in here. For this session today, we're going to spend the next 2 hours talking a lot about autism spectrum disorder, as you may imagine. Not only understanding it, some of the challenges and potential strengths that go along with it, but then also what are some of those evidence-based practices for learners with autism. And I'll say right up front, just because you do not have autism does not mean you can't benefit from some of these things that we are going to focus on. So in one way or another, it's just some ways of best practice for trying to set up the learning environment to a variety of needs, to addressing some of the lagging skills that you may see in other students who do not have autism. So this will be applicable across the board. And we'll cover a lot in the next 2 hours, but we can't cover everything. So I will also give you some resources that you can use to move forward and hopefully incorporate into your day-to-day practice. Before we kind of get officially underway here then, another thing to point out is we'll take a very short break in the middle. I hopefully will have some time at the end for any questions along the way, or especially at the end. The chat feature of Zoom is a great way to communicate. So if you're not familiar with it by this point, look into that. And then at the end, hopefully we can have some questions, scenarios, etc. But let's get going here. Okay, so we're going to spend most of the time focusing on autism. Before we do so, let's talk for just a moment or two about disability more generally. If we ask ourselves or someone else, what is a disability? Historically, we've answered that question primarily using what's referred to as the medical model that you see here on the left-hand side of the screen. So this is carryover from the way that we've conceptualized disease, viruses, bacteria. If you get the cold, the flu, etc., you primarily treat the individual or the virus within. With disability, there's definitely still an individual component. There's something that we have to consider about the individual, but also just as much so we have to think about the world around them and how that impacts them, the supports that they may or may not have. So to answer this question, it isn't a matter of one or the other, picking one. It is a combination of both. Disability really is the interaction of individual personal needs as well as the supports that someone may find in the world around them. So to give two hypothetical examples of this, let's say pre-COVID, you get to go on vacation and you get to go somewhere fun, but when you arrive, they don't speak English as the native language. So you're a non-native speaker. Although nothing has changed about you, you've now gone into a new environment, a new social context, and it's going to be harder to communicate with others, to meet your basic needs, to navigate the world around you. And so that's one example of how just altering one side of this equation can have a fairly sizable impact. Going the other direction, let's say once again you get to jet off somewhere fun and you go snowboarding or parasailing or hang gliding, something wild and crazy, but you break your arm, you break your leg, and by the time you return home, it's going to be harder to navigate flights of stairs, to cook, to clean, to dress. And so while nothing has changed about the home that you return to, your personal characteristics are altered, at least temporarily. And so one of the big takeaways hopefully you can get from this session is, on a broad scale, when we can incorporate different sorts of supports into the environments that we're in, and for some that's at home, for others that's in the community. Today we're really focusing on school. When those things are available, disabilities become really nothing more or are just differences. And differences are okay. They're actually a good thing in multiple ways. The challenge is currently many of the differences associated with autism spectrum disorder, specifically as a disability, impact someone's outcomes in adulthood and their overall quality of life. So there's a lot of studies that have looked into that in different ways. This is one that I like to highlight, especially because it comes from a national sample. So it has, it's not specific to any one kind of geographic area. It also incorporates autism amongst all of the other disability categories within special education. And this one in particular, what they were looking at is upon that transition outside of school and education, what are those outcomes? And while some do experience, positive pro-social outcomes, across the board, that by no means is kind of what we can expect at this point. However you want to break it down across post-secondary education, work experience, independent living, quality of life, we don't see that great of outcomes, especially amongst our transition students with ASD and or co-occurring conditions. The other thing that's a bit concerning is our understanding, our knowledge base, our plan doesn't go that much past that point. So when we look at individuals into their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, both those who have been diagnosed have kind of gone through education and medical systems from, kind of the 90s onwards. But there's also many people amongst us in our communities who weren't diagnosed, who maybe are unidentified, who are still in need of certain supports in different areas. As we keep going here, to get a bit technical or specific for just a moment, autism is what we would consider a pervasive neurodevelopmental disorder. So to unpack that a bit, what that means is pervasive in the sense of it impacts almost all areas of life, as we'll talk about as we go through. It is brain-based, is a neurological difference, and this has to do with how that development unfolds over time. So the brain that you are born with is not the brain necessarily that you have, when you're 13 or 21 or 31. So that is a continual developmental process, and as that unfolds, especially in the early years of life, that's where some of those behavioral differences originally stem from. Autism in itself is not a disease. It's not something that you can spread or catch in that sense. It also is not considered a mental illness, but we also will talk about there are other conditions that do fall in that category that apply to many individuals on the spectrum. These current estimates are from what's called the ADDM surveillance studies. These numbers come out every few years. And for the last few rounds, there's been a site specific to Minnesota. So that is not the whole state. That only includes Hennepin and Ramsey counties, which is basically Minneapolis, St. Paul. They pull all of the medical and educational records of 8-year-olds, and that's where these numbers come from. And so they are not perfect numbers. There's definitely some considerations that go into them. Overall, we've seen increases in those numbers, especially over the last few decades. A lot of that is the product of that identification, that diagnostic process. So the idea of kind of an autism epidemic, I would push back against in a sense, because it's not that those individuals weren't necessarily here, like I said, in our community. It's just, have we, kind of identified them, diagnosed them, and probably most critically, connected them to the supports that are needed to be successful. You'll see here, if you were to Google this or some, in a news story, it's very common to see about a 4-to-1 ratio of males to females on the spectrum. This is another good example, kind of like prevalence. This is an imperfect number, and I add an asterisk because it's likely there are many females who are undiagnosed, unidentified. A few factors that play into that. Autism, especially on a behavioral level, observational behavioral level, may be easier to, or not easier, that's not the right, it may appear differently in males versus females. There's some of the gender norms and even biases that play into that. Along with that is a bit of a bias in itself of thinking that this is a much more prevalent male to female disability. So it is more common in males as we understand it, at least currently, but I would say it's more probably the 3-to-1, 2-to-1 ratio in its of itself. There's many avenues that we could go down similar to that. So autism is a very interesting topic, but we want to keep moving for the sake of today. So to introduce this as well, sorry, just a second. It is the rule rather than the exception that someone who has a diagnosis of autism is going to have at least one other mental or physical health condition, diagnosis, etc. So under the category of mental health, anxiety is probably the most prevalent in multiple forms. Along with that, mood disorders, ADHD is an interesting dynamic of both how are they different and how are they similar, especially when they are co-diagnosed. Something similar as well for OCD. Physical health-wise, epilepsy, seizure episodes, seizure disorder, I've seen numbers, definitely a quarter, maybe up to a third of individuals at one time or another will have those sort of considerations. The other thing I always like to pass along, especially to this sort of audience, is I've seen it's relatively rare or few and far between, but I've seen some individuals who don't experience their first seizure episode until they're 18, 19, 21 years of age. And so just consider that, especially if you're working with that transition age population. Gastrointestinal, I like to describe as anywhere, from start to finish, dietary preferences, sensitivities, allergies, restrictions, stomach issues, colitis, constipation, diet, and this sort of thing is not uncommon to need some special consideration. Same goes for sleep or motor challenges, motor impairment. Not everyone with autism is going to have that sort of thing, but we can expect, at least among a decent segment of the autistic population, that we will have to consider these things, especially from a school standpoint. This is something that is pretty fundamental to understanding autism, so let's spend a few minutes unpacking what we see here. Don't get hung up in any of the specifics. This is a very broad, like I said, kind of fundamental underlying thing to understand, especially when it comes to any of these labels at the bottom. But what you see here is 3 lines representing 3 hypothetical individuals. We'll describe the green line as typically developing as we may consider it. The blue line, developmentally delayed. This also can represent more of an intellectual disability, a category such as Down syndrome. So as we may expect, if we compare the green line and the blue line, there are differences in skill ability, with the blue line overall being reduced. What they share in common, or what you need to take away, is the variance in level of skill across different areas. So if we take the highest score, the lowest score, however you want to break it down, that is what they share in common, and that is what we need to focus on. It is a very even profile of development in a general sense across the board, with the blue line underneath the green line. What sets autism apart is the variance. We describe this as staggered, scattered, splintered, disordered, I don't love that last term, profiles of development, where we can simultaneously have exceptionalities, high-level skills, fairly significant deficits, as well as anywhere in between. And so this particular red line tends to represent what used to be diagnosed as Asperger's syndrome. We would often describe as high-functioning autism, where we have a very high-level IQ, relatively intact language skills, but significant social skills significant deficits rather in social skills, among other challenges. The problem with those sort of labels that I just used, and aren't politically incorrect, they're just a bit of a misnomer, comes from failure to understand this, along with the significant variability of individuals we see on the spectrum. So let's take a second to consider both of these quotes, who come from professionals and self-advocates on the spectrum. On the left, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, from Dr. Stephen Shore. Meaning, if your neighbor, your student, your child is on the spectrum, that is one example. And there's things we can take away from that and apply and generalize, but we have to consider it on that individual level at some point. With those high functioning, low functioning labels that I just referred to, if we don't appreciate what we just talked through on this slide, if we tend to assume, like almost every other person we meet in our lives who is non-autistic, if we apply that even keel across different areas, then like this person describes, the differences between high functioning and low functioning is that you tend to either ignore the deficits or the assets. So if you're described as high functioning, when you have those significant challenges, they tend to be minimized and vice versa. And so we're going to balance, as I introduce kind of that medical and social model, we're really going to tend to focus more on that medical model side, which you could also describe as the deficit model of autism, because that is very much what makes up the educational criteria and practice at this point. So we can differentiate. There is the DSM for that medical diagnosis. We're focusing more on that eligibility for special education in the context of schools. Both of those tie back to this around 1980 when autism was first introduced into the DSM. These three areas referred to as the Triad of Impairments. If you're a special education teacher, this is why there's those three separate areas of the criteria. From the DSM standpoint, they've actually now combined socialization and communication into one area. So nothing is eliminated, but truly every year that goes by, that educational criteria, at least both at the federal and state level, are becoming more and more outdated. I'm going to talk through it and describe it from this angle. This is something I've made. This is nothing that's been validated or verified, but I'm going to break it down into more categories than just that triad. But along the way, I also want you to focus on this continuum at the bottom, that any one of these areas could make up severe to more mild to more average skills. And there's even areas where there's strength or exceptionality. Some of those kind of savant skills that we see in some, but not all individuals on the spectrum. We're also going to talk about how these all tie together into that area in between here, between adaptive behavior and the such. Let's keep moving. Communication, we can further break down expressively and receptively. Are we taking in communication, or are we expressing or delivering it? From an expressive standpoint, it's not uncommon to have some form of speech delay, especially in early milestones. The majority of students with autism do go on to develop some form of at least minimal verbal speech, but there are some individuals who are nonverbal. That doesn't mean they can't communicate. It means with the motor mouth portions of their body, that is not how they are able to do so. Even among most of those who do have verbal speech, there's a tendency, and this is kind of a theme we will talk about from multiple angles, this idea of kind of scripted, repetitive patterns of language. And so the technical term is echolalia. We can talk about a more immediate form that's kind of just parroting back what is said to you. Hi, how are you today? Rather than replying, you respond with, hi, how are you today? There's also a more delayed form. This can be language that comes from a movie, a TV show, a video game, someone in an individual's life. The general theme here is trouble with producing those kind of novel new utterances or forms of speech. We can also see a difference in the prosody, the tone, the pitch, the intonation, but let's keep moving. Receptively, two main themes. Processing, a need for more processing time. So if you ask someone a question, you're used to getting an answer within a matter of seconds. If someone needs 10, 15 seconds to both process what you said and then deliver a response, that's a bit unnatural, but that's a very easy accommodation or alteration we can make. Same goes for using more language that is more literal, more concrete, trying to stay away from some of those more complex phrases of speech. We'll come back to this when we talk about some of the practical strategies. Communication and socialization are very linked, but differences we may see. First and foremost, there's no gold standard. There's no rule of socializing. It's a very dynamic, adaptive set of skills and process. That is why it is challenging for many people with autism. So it's really hard to say this is necessarily the right way to do it. It's often easier to describe it from that deficit model where it misses the mark. I talk about it as kind of an under or over compensation to what feels right. So that could be reciprocity, the back and forth. Someone who won't reciprocate, you're trying to strike up a conversation, they're not giving you anything to work with. You ask someone a question from the other side, and they say, you know, they hog the conversation. You ask them how their weekend was, 10 minutes later, you're still not even to Sunday. We can see it both ways across these different categories. Same goes for eye contact. Avoiding eye contact can be just as bad as making too much eye contact. There's things about autism that make this inherently difficult. So often, unless it's necessary to examine the eyes, there's something to see. By avoiding eye contact, if you understand autism, it allows individuals to usually focus more on what you're saying, what they're thinking about, etc. So unless it's necessary, this is another great, very simple accommodation that you can make. These next two, I have two different students that I've worked with in the past that make great examples of this. One is a guy who's his social expression, his affect tended to always be very, very positive. I enjoyed interacting with him because he just left you feeling really good. He's smiling, he's telling you how great you are, etc. He had that same demeanor though, even if he was feeling a bit upset or frustrated or anxious, etc. So one time I went into his class and I greeted him and he said, "Mr. Ringenberg, I'm feeling super pissed off today. I might hit somebody," something along that line. That's a very mismatch between the external and the internal expression and affect. Kind of an example to the contrary in some ways. Another student who often would eat lunch in the resource room, when he was done, before it was time to return to class, he would pace back and forth. He was probably acting out some sort of script from like a video game or something. So he's moving his arms, he's making some mouth noises, but outwardly, it seems like someone who's kind of on edge or could become unpredictable or unsafe. If you saw someone doing that in the community, you may be a bit unnerved. And so I knew what this student was doing, why he was doing it. As the person responsible for, you know, his supervision at the time, sometimes I would check in much more for my sake than for his, just to verify that based on the impressions that I've kind of come to expect, does that actually mean that this is how you are feeling? Overall, let's not overgeneralize. Once again, autism is not agoraphobia. Many individuals want to have relationships and socialize. It may not be here or about that or with you. Think about going to, you know, a big gala event versus having a few friends over. There's different interests and levels of socializing. Whose preferences are you promoting in if you feel like someone's not interested in engaging? These last two are pretty fundamental to autism, so I would encourage you also to look at the other one-sheet handout, especially if you're looking for kind of a description of theory of mind. But what this boils down to on a general level is the ability to understand that as a human, I have thoughts, ideas, intentions, beliefs, desires. So do you, but we are different. And so that ability to take someone else's perspective and understand that we are not necessarily one and the same, even though in many ways we are. Also, this last point is the ability to take away, to pick up on social cues and take away social learning without that model of direct instruction. So if you teach Phi-Ed, math, language arts, science, whatever your topic of expertise is, that sort of model of instruction for things that usually we don't maybe do so, like how to navigate the hallway, how to be socially appropriate in the restroom, etc. The unwritten rules, the hidden curriculums of different social norms that we all follow, we expect others to follow, but we need to acknowledge that to some degree, we don't talk about those things. Some of us get by without it, but if there's a decent portion of our community, however you define that, that needs that level of teaching, that form of social information, I don't see a reason why we shouldn't be working to provide it. The last area of that triad of impairment, and then we'll move into talking about executive functions just a bit more broadly. Let's first focus on the cognitive flexibility. I describe this as the other side of the coin from that rigid, restrictive pattern of thoughts, behavior, actions, etc. The reason we see those things amongst these individuals is because this is often much more of a challenge than many of us can personally kind of experience or appreciate. Different ways to describe this: a tendency to focus in on the details, and I'll give an example of this on the next slide. Be much more detail-oriented and hyper-focused, which can lead to deep knowledge of certain topics, but it also hinders or makes it more difficult to multitask, to tolerate interruptions. You're going to be much more dependent on structure in your directions, activities, different environments or settings. All of us utilize routines in our lives. When you get up in the morning, you go through the same set of steps because until you've had a cup of coffee, you don't want to have to think about anything. The difference is, if I have to alter my routine in the morning, normally my wife showers first and then I do. If we have to switch, I don't have to really commute much anymore, but along the way after I drop off my kids, if I have to stop at the bank, pick up a prescription, those are adaptations, changes, alterations to my routine that I don't even notice because this is not a challenge for me. Part of what goes along with the differences that really underlie the neurology of autism is we refer to it as bottom-up processing. So as I just said, you start with the details and then you expand that to theme, topic, main idea, whatever. A lot of us and our society, our community tends to be set up, laid out in ways that are more conducive to top-down processing. So we immediately zero into the theme, the main idea, the takeaway, the important information, and then after that, we can consider more minute details, however you want to describe it. So the example here is, you could replace this with any sort of photo or picture that you found. If I were to ask you, I'm going to hang this in an art gallery, what should I call it? What's the title? I'm sure for many of you, even if you have no tangible connection to this, in a matter of seconds, you think, well, rainy day in the city, lunchtime on a rainy day, however you want to describe it, that's where you go to first before you start to look at why is this is there a headlight, you know, on this bag? I really like how I can see kind of the neon, whatever, through the translucent umbrellas. Those are more specific details. And so the task that I just gave you is a fairly fundamental task across many different settings or environments. But for people with autism, it's the opposite. And to steal a quote from one of probably, additionally, one of the most popular, widely known self-advocates with autism, Temple Grandin, she likens school to trying to listen to the radio with all of the stations playing at the same time. So it's not that you can't make sense or, you know, understand any of them individually. It's that conductor of the orchestra kind of putting it together so that it's not just noise, it's music. And so to go back to that picture, if you are processing from the bottom up, if you're taking very specific individual details, there are certain questions that you would be able to answer based on you know, the activity I just did with you. But that one that I did, the topic, the main idea, the theme, this would be a much harder question given this amount of information than others. Cognitive flexibility is one of several parts of executive functioning, which is something we develop over time, the frontal lobe of our brain. And along with our working in memory, our inhibitory control, it allows us to do these 5 things among many, many others. It's the skills that are needed if you get an assignment on the first day of class that's due on the last day of the quarter. You're gonna have to plan and sequence and do some of those things along the way. So those skills combined is how we control our cognitive control of our behavior, to select and monitor those behaviors to work towards goals big and small. And this graph is not autism specific. These are skills that go into our development in the 20s and 30s. So we have to acknowledge that for all students along the way. Another consideration for those with autism as we approach a quick break here, coming up not too long, we have at least 8 sensory systems based on the way to define it we use. I'm sure you've heard of the first 5. We refer to them as the 5 basic senses. We teach them in schools and via a big yellow bird. But in addition to that, we have at least 3 others. Our sense of balance and movement, which is our vestibular system, our body positioning and the pressure on our muscles, joints, and ligaments. That's our proprioceptive system. And our internal sensory system that is referred to as our interoception or interoceptive system. And we'll come back to that one specifically. For most of us, in any one of these areas or senses, no matter where you are, if you're inside, you're outside, you're at home, you're in the community, you get enough of this to make sense of it, the world around you rather, but it's often not so to the point where it becomes overwhelming and you say, I gotta get out of here. Unless you are at a rock concert and it's getting way too loud, or, you know, unless you find yourself any other example, it's much more extreme. Individuals with autism, we tend to see falling much more at an extreme end of this continuum of hypersensitivity, i.e. too much, or hyposensitivity, i.e. I need more, I'm gonna try to seek it out. So every individual, once again, is going to be different. Just because you're hypersensitive in one area doesn't mean you're hypersensitive in another. If there's any OTs out there, shout out to you. I know you know where I'm heading here. With those with autism, although we need to take it on that individual level, with the 5 basic senses, we tend to see a bit more of that hypersensitivity. The sounds are too loud, the lights are too bright, the tastes and smells are too strong, the tag on my shirt is itching me. There's many examples to the contrary, but that's probably, if I had to pick one or the other, what I would tend to focus on. It's the opposite for the other 3. This is where we tend to see more of a hyposensitivity, and this is why we see some of the behavioral differences that we see, especially with stimming behaviors that we'll talk about on the next slide. But if I'm seeking out vestibular sorts of input from a sensory standpoint, then I am going to move my body back and forth, or I'm going to spin it in a circle. If I'm seeking out proprioceptive input, I'm going to wear tight-fitting clothing. I'm going to use a weighted blanket. I'm going to like to burrow under a bunch of, mats in the gym. If you see someone who toe walks, one reason may be if you walk up on your tiptoes, that puts more pressure from your body weight on your feet. So that doesn't ensure it, but I hope you're seeing that connection between we are finding ways, one way or another, whether they are planned or not, to provide this sort of sensory input. Lastly, everything else that we've talked about primarily is coming from the world around us and making sense of how, this is the other way. This is when we're hungry, we're thirsty, we're hot, we're cold, we're tired, we're in pain, we're sick. Those sensations from our internal sensory environment or world that our brain combines with all of these other things to make sense of multiple contexts. And so to reiterate, whether it's fidgeting, rocking, pacing, flapping, scripting, this idea of we see this restricted, repetitive pattern of behavior, language, etc. One thing that plays a lot into that is what I just described, and these things are used to offset that. They're a coping mechanism. So I've seen multiple examples where we do want to shape these behaviors, but overall, from a foundational basic standpoint, I will always promote the idea of if someone needs to flap their hands, they need to fidget, they need to pace. If it's not having a detrimental impact on those around them, in one sense or another, that's not that much different between if you need a cup of coffee to start the day, if you need a cigarette after lunch, if you start to fall asleep, if you don't take a walk in the afternoon. And so, once again, this is another great sign of if someone's needing to stim, what is the reason for that? Rather than maybe addressing the stimming directly, what it is about the world around them that's making them anxious or overwhelmed or frustrated, etc. The last thing I'll add before we move on from that, the last point I'll make, if there is pressure to conform, and I've seen that from parents, from teachers, from bosses, I've also seen that from students, from individuals who recognize even if this is okay on some level, my preference is not to go to college and be sitting in class flapping my hands. It isn't all or nothing. We can shape that behavior. We can designate a time or place, but let's move away from the idea of someone having to go to college, go to work, go to school, and pretend that they don't have autism for 8 hours if really what's holding them back is something along these levels. To give one example to the contrary, I started out as a paraprofessional with a young man. When he would get upset, his tendency was to bite himself on the arm, get a nice welt and callus going from years of that. Rather than just telling him, hey, don't do that, we would try to have him wear a chew tube around his neck. When we could see he was getting upset or frustrated or anxious, we would try to promote him biting that instead. So another example of I'm not saying carte blanche that there aren't reasons why we wouldn't want to address these things, but change the way that you see them and think about how it can be somewhere in between that all or nothing. One of the last areas before the break here, emotional competence, as I describe it, both the ability to be aware of emotions in ourselves and others, as well as to regulate these things. This ties back a lot to that interoceptive awareness we just talked about from a sensory standpoint. This long term on the bottom, alexithymia, we see that in many individuals with autism, but it also has a lot of co-occurrence with depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, eating disorder. So it's a bit of a trans-diagnostic process or consideration. I would describe this as an overall fundamental, very hypo, very low sensitivity to that internal sort of sensory information. So whereas if I'm feeling uncomfortable, am I sick? Am I tired? Am I anxious? Am I hungry? Am I frustrated? That takes a very higher level of understanding that someone may not have. And so someone that can say, I'm comfortable, I'm uncomfortable, I'm upset, or I'm not upset. But there's many different things that can kind of be aligned with those categories that are harder to make sense of. And so we'll come back to that as a way to something to address via some of the strategies after the break. Lastly here, the last thing I want to talk about and how all these tie together has to do with adaptive behavior. And so this is how it's defined by the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. A study, to pull a quote, the big thing I want you to consider is this is essential to being independent, however you define that. And this is the connection from IQ to that real world skill. So IQ to EQ, book smarts to street smarts. This definitely ties in those executive functions in many ways, but being able to be adaptive with our behavior is fundamental to many of those things. Amongst our community who is on the spectrum, once again, these are very critical, and this is demonstrated again. These are the variables most associated with those positive or negative outcomes. What is unique about autism is that we say a gap between that IQ, that cognitive potential, and those skills that widens or increases with age into adulthood. So that doesn't mean skills are being lost because these are norm referenced assessments. It means things that are, any progress that is being made is much lower and slower in comparison to any peers or comparison group, and even those that we could break down among other disability categories. Especially among that quote unquote high functioning segment where we see a gap between IQ and adaptive functioning, that seems to either be a prerequisite or a risk factor for some of those comorbid, co-occurring mental health conditions. The main thing I want you to take away from all of this as we take a short break right after is an example how I'm going to try to pull that all together or illustrate it. So amongst all of these examples, I'm going to pull an example from money or use of money, etc. I myself have worked personally with students or set IEP objectives along the routes of, you know, that hypothetical of, here's the scenario, let's make change, let's make sure you can do the equation, let's also make sure that you aren't taken advantage of, etc. Very worthwhile functional skills, the gap that we need to acknowledge or I want to point out here. Let's say that I've worked with a student for 4 weeks now on those skills and I'm feeling really good about it. And so my assignment, my homework for the weekend is, student, I want you to go to the store, the convenience store, wherever. I want you to make a transaction. I want you to make a purchase in real life. We're going to work to generalize those skills, etc. So student says, yes, we got the money, whatever. We're at the counter. Items are on the table. It comes out to $5.31 of change. We pay with a $10 bill. Things are going great. It just so happens that a $5 bill is not in the cash register, not in the till. So the cashier lays 5 ones on the table along with 31 cents. And the student looks at them and says, "You didn't give me the right change." And the cashier says, "What are you talking about? Take your $5.31. If me as a teacher, as an instructor, whoever is building this skill, out of happenstance, out of convenience, through no consideration of any sort of malice, every time I've given the student $5 and change, I've given them a $5 bill. And so going back to the counter, going back to that transition, in my eyes, neither one of these individuals is incorrect. The breakdown, the gap is generalizing that skill in the sense of when I see $5, I expect a $5 bill, not 5 ones. And so I want you to consider that and kind of chew on it. I'm going to take just a moment or two to drink a little bit of water and step away for just a moment, but I do want to keep moving. So I want you to keep it minimal. If you do stick by your computer, I want you to think about 1 or more things you learned about autism that you maybe didn't know before that first half. And then I also want you to think about questions you may have for the end. Even when I did a lot of live training, and now especially via Zoom, crowds are very respectful, but they're very timid and quiet. And I encourage you, even if it's 2 or 3 questions, that we take advantage of this time that we have in front of us. So I will be back in 2 to 3 minutes, and then we will finish up with strategies, questions, just shortly. See you soon. Okay, I'm going to start bringing us back here. I'm going to buy about 30 seconds or more, but we're going to get back at it. So please rejoin as soon as you can. This second half is all going to be about strategies, practices, interventions, however you want to refer to it, so that you have the awareness and understanding. I'm going to point out some of the things that maybe you're already doing, maybe what the title, the label, the evidence-based practice is. So we're going to come at it from that standpoint, but we're also not going to get hung up on too many of those details and focus more on what are the things you can take away from this session that don't require additional training, money. I'm going to leave you with some resources, so hopefully minimal investment of time, etc. What you see on the slide here, the team out of UNC just put out the second edition of this manual that really does this huge review of all the research out there and says, what are those evidence-based practices that are effective for individuals with ASD? So these are important to focus on for two quick reasons. One, it keeps that quote unquote snake oil salesman at bay, especially families who maybe recently got that diagnosis. If only you do this, if only you pay me this amount of money, I can address all of those things that you are concerned about. And so it definitely makes things have to be viable, somewhat evidence-based, but also it focuses on those specific focused interventions. It's not this packaged, branded, trademarked set of things. So it's very practical, especially for parents at home and educators in the classroom. There's 20 to 30 or so that you could dive into. I'm going to focus on just a couple. The other thing I'll point out quickly is often these are done at least one or more together. It's fairly few and far between that these are done in isolation. So as I talk about them individually, see how there's also connections between them. One of the connections that all of these strategies share, one way that they can be used is what's referred to as an antecedent-based intervention. So that takes the three-term contingency from ABA, the antecedent, the behavior, the consequence. And another way to look at it is, especially for an antecedent, how can we prevent challenging behavior from arising or promote the things we want to see? From a behavioral standpoint, how can we teach those replacement behaviors that could be used instead? And then finally, if we do experience challenges, if things aren't going the way that we want them to, or to promote those replacement behaviors we've identified, how can we adjust how we are responding to a student? So as I mentioned, the strategies I'm going to talk about today, you could probably make the case many of them could be used across these three areas. I'm going to tend to focus on how they can be used a bit more from a proactive, preventative standpoint. So in a very broad sense, and there's different specific strategies we'll look at that would fall under this category, but an antecedent-based intervention is something that you prepare, something that you have available, some sort of modification within the environment or the context in order, once again, to either reduce challenging behavior or to promote the behaviors that you want to see in that setting. So it's very proactive, very prevention focused, but we also need to consider who is setting that standard. There are definitely social norms, social expectations, but I just gave you a very tangible example when it comes to something like hand flapping. If we're trying to completely eliminate that from the classroom, that may be promoting a bit of a neuronormative sort of perspective. So different ways that you can do this. You can modify the activities, materials. We'll talk about schedules specifically, incorporating any sort of learner choice into those activities or materials. And choice can lead you to the same outcome. Do you want to do number 1 first or number 2 first? Do you want to do this assignment at school or do you want to do it at home? those all end with my desired outcome of let's get this done by incorporating some choice in the matter that tends to get some buy-in and have a pretty natural, de-escalatory impact. When those transitions are coming up, we may need to prep our learners, especially those with ASD, a bit more ahead of time, whether that's going to the next class, whether that's a new teacher that's going to be filling in while someone's on maternity leave. Let's think about those things we can anticipate. And we can't anticipate everything, but sometimes there's very obvious ways that we can say, I see that coming 2 weeks from now. Let's try to find a way to address it and not just leave it kind of on a whim of we'll see what that Monday happens to bring. Just a second, I'm still navigating Zoom a bit to a degree, and 2 monitors, sometimes I lose my cursor. As educators, you know a lot about differentiation. Let's keep moving here so we have time for a question. When you're going to arrange an environment, whether that's in the classroom, whether that's at home, I just Googled. I was just looking for basically a stock image that I think is, especially for educators, what may come to mind. This is not a gold standard. This is very practical to me, right? Like, we had to set up a home learning environment. I'll tell you, it's not top level, it's not the Mercedes, it's not the Lexus, it's the middle of the line. But if you're thinking about these things, that's what's most important. So, are those spaces as clearly defined as they can be? Are we making materials as easy to access as we can? This is a big one with younger brother. How can we try to minimize those distractions? The sensory considerations we just talked about, whether it's having sensory tools available, whether it's having dim lamp lighting instead of overhead fluorescent, and then any academic, social, emotional supports. If we know, especially, we may need it, let's have it there on the ready versus not. So just some other, any of those 8 sensory systems, we may be considering different things. I like to talk about it as we can give individuals tools and strategies to adapt themselves to the environment around them. As we can also make the environment as conducive as possible, but we can't retrofit our buildings all the time, or usually we can't always control the lights, the sounds, the temperature. And so we need to have a bit of both to make things as conducive as possible. Another thing to do up front from that antecedent proactive standpoint, if you're not already doing so, is to focus on positive expectations, what to do instead of what not to do. And you can have a balance of both. There are definitely skills and rules that are critical to all students, all individuals, that are specific to do not do this either across the board, in this setting, at this time, etc. So I'm not saying we can't have rules and limits. This gets at that fundamental ability, or usually deficit with autism, to deduce, to infer these things in the absence of this more explicit type of teaching or reference tool. And so the way you teach math, reading, writing, how to play a trombone, how to ride a bike, is you give some instruction and some guidance, you demonstrate or model it, you allow someone to practice and rehearse, and you give feedback on what's going well and what needs to be worked on. So once again, for some of us, we don't need that, and that's okay. If you need that sort of instruction or that sort of input to guide your behavior for how, once again, to navigate the hall, the restroom, the lunch room, we need to find ways to provide that that aren't overly taxing especially on you as educators. So one of my favorite taglines is in the middle here: telling does not equal teaching. I told you how to play the trombone. I told you how to tap dance. Now let's see it. Those sound ridiculous. Insert the alternative as you wish. Once again, just interpersonally, so nothing that necessarily requires further training, except like something you could go do at 3:01 today. Default to language that is skews towards the simple, clear, and literal. I was given a training not quite a year ago up north in Thief River Falls, and I had a guy come up to me and say, when you were kind of talking about the language challenges with autism, as a non-native speaker, a lot of that made sense. So if that's another way for you to think about it, obviously we don't do so in a condescending manner, but as we need to, we talk slower, we use simpler vocabulary, and we try to stay away from those non-literal phrases of speech that might be confusing. We can also allow for that additional processing time. I'm overseeing a practicum for a student at the U of M that uses AAC. So on an iPad, they basically have a talking device. They are verbal, but this is more conducive to most interactions. And because we're connecting via Zoom, I personally have found it very refreshing, because this is a very one-sided interaction. When it is more of that back and forth, that meeting sort of use, I tend to cut people off. I tend to struggle digitally to kind of navigate those transitions. With this individual, I'll say something and they have a pre-programmed button that says, I have something to say. And so I say, okay. And then while I'm doing that, I'm looking at my phone, I'm checking my email, I'm doing something else. And like I said, really that downtime, that back and forth, yes, it takes more time, but I'll just say, anecdotally, I've found that refreshing, especially in this non-face-to-face sort of interaction. We're going to come back to this, so I won't dwell on it, but breaking things down into smaller steps, whether that's getting ready for recess, whether that's deciding what you want to do when you grow up. Let's not try to leap from beginning to end, from all to nothing. How can we segment and sequence different tasks? I talked about how choices are effective. Written, visual is something that you'll see overlaps among many of these things. It has to do with having that concrete reference. So even if you don't have a pre-made visual, you got a pen and a paper, you got a whiteboard and a marker, write it down, draw it out, use what you got. And especially if that back and forth verbally is breaking down, that is something you can fall back on to try to facilitate communication. Lastly, first then statements are a great language tool. I use them with both my sons. First, you have to clean up your toys, then we can go outside. First, you have to eat your dinner, then you can have a snack. So it's just a great language tool for sequencing upcoming events and expectations. Another antecedent-focused strategy that's important to be aware of is a social narrative. In a broad sense, these are simple stories that, once again, visually, so by pictures, by text, they represent a social situation or some sort of social routine, and focusing once again on those expected, positive, appropriate behaviors. The other thing too that I want to stress is we're not just focusing on what to do, but why to do it. That's the piece that gets lost, that social cognition that's often missing for those with autism. Yeah, I understand I'm supposed to make eye contact. Why is that important? Yes, I understand when I go into a job interview, XYZ, why? That's just as important as those actual behaviors. So We can also focus on that theory of mind. Why is this important for what they are thinking, etc. These are often individualized. One way to do so is, some individuals, especially those with a co-occurring intellectual disability, can confuse some of those non-proper nouns, the pronouns, the you, me, they, etc. So if we need to insert actual names, that's one example. And there's many ways to do so, but combining pictures and text. This is based on the work of Carol Gray, so shout out to her. A social story is a very specific form of social narrative. More information if you're interested, but that's a trademark term, approach. We're going to focus on social narratives as the alternative. So these can be used prior to that upcoming transition or new experience, after some sort of error has occurred, or as a teaching intervention for some sort of reoccurring behavior. So prevent, teach, reinforce, anywhere along the way. There's 4 basic sentence types of social narratives. The majority are going to be descriptive, it's the who, what, when, where, why, how. It's the facts. Here's where it is, here's where you go, here's what time, etc. I just talked about this, but along the way, the perspective sentences are where we're going to share that hidden curriculum, that social, emotional information that is just as important as where do you go, who do you talk to, what are the things that you need to be thinking about from a social standpoint. Affirmatives are another form of descriptive sentence. I talk about these as clarifying absolutes. So if it's against the law, if it's never okay, they kind of reiterate or repeat a descriptive sentence in one way or another to really hammer home this is critical. And then directive sentences guiding behavior along the way of the who, what, when, where, why, how, and what are others thinking, what am I thinking, what is the interpersonal impact, what are some of the things I could do if I'm becoming overwhelmed or I'm confused or I'm ready to go, then what? That's more of that directive. So 2 quick examples, one that's only text-based, and so I would definitely recommend pairing this with some photos. Unless there's a reason not to, I prefer and recommend using actual photographs, especially with smartphones. It's not hard to take a quick trip to the library, snap a photo of the front door, the checkout desk, etc. But this walks through, once again, not only that routine of going to the library and checking out books, but what are some of those behaviors and why do I do that? What is the impact to me? On the right, this is an example where we maybe don't use real photographs because it has to do with a hygiene routine that isn't unimportant, but especially if you are an educator making this support for an individual or a family, I know you understand why that's a consideration. So this is a bit of a combination of a social narrative and a task analysis, which we'll talk about shortly, but breaking down what are those positive, what are those things I do need to do, hopefully on a daily basis as a young man from a hygiene standpoint. But again, why is that important to consider? And so social narratives are definitely a form of visual support. We're going to talk about a few others. Once again, to reiterate, the purpose here is to provide some sort of concrete cue of information so that once I say it, once you're not holding it in mind, there's some sort of thing to reference so that if those 2 things aren't available, it can be we can fall back on it. And so that's what this last point means. When we are in the absence of this form of support in one way or another, it relies much more on those executive functions that I talked about earlier. There's many different forms that this can take, and they are effective for multiple reasons that we talked about in the first half, reasons why not just relying on verbal instructions are conducive to fostering both not only learning and development, but also independence and self-determination for these students. The main reason why for me has to do with this prompting hierarchy. So if you haven't seen something like this before, it's useful for you to be aware of. You'll see a few slightly different forms out there. As I looked among them to find the one that I preferred, this is the one I liked, and I'll explain why. Some you'll find will put some of these lower, the verbal or even the modeling, above some of the gestural and the visual. What I want to focus on is, as already mentioned, independence to the greatest extent possible is the goal for all students. That's going to mean different things for different people. The only form of prompting on this list that is not independent, that does not require another human being to be present, is visual prompting or visual support. So to gesture, to verbalize, to model, to physically prompt, you have to have a teacher, a parent, a one-to-one, a PCA, however you want to think about it. And so if we're looking, once again, to not go from all to nothing, from start to finish, if we want to fade not having a certain individual in a certain place to provide that form of support, the only option other than expecting someone to do it independently is to have some sort of visual tool. So that is why this is incredibly important in order to promote independence across those most meaningful settings. Different ways to do so. Visual boundaries are almost commonplace nowadays thanks to COVID. It's where you need to be and where you need to not to be. So when I was in a school, we'd put tape around the edge of the desk or in front of the cabinet. That was meant for staff only. Anywhere you go nowadays, you see some sort of very tangible example of providing a visual support to represent some sort of boundary. We can also give many other forms of cues. Once again, it can take many different forms. The commonality is that they are visual and concrete. So here's a photo of a hodgepodge of tools that I developed and used or provided, I should say, for students that I worked with. I didn't develop the 5-point scale, but whether it's just a laminated version of something that's available, or this is meant to be a manipulative 5-point scale. So a student who, especially as they escalate or they move up the scale, their ability to communicate that verbally goes down. Well, then let's rely on a non-verbal way for you to say, I started class at a 1, I'm actually at a 4 right now, and it'd be good for me to take a break. If I only rely on them to do so verbally, I'm kind of anticipating, or I'm not stacking the deck in my favor for them to be able to do so in the way that I want them to, and I can't make it not necessarily happen. This here is, sorry, finding my cursor again, these 5 boxes. This is a token economy, so there's different Pokemon characters that you can put in each of those. This was for filling out a planner. We started out every day. You got your planner done at the end of the day. After a while, we faded to every other day. You could go to every week, etc. In the middle here, the stop, relax, and think. Pretty common sort of strategy, etc., to be working with some sort of pull-out provider. We were working on generalizing that skill into the classroom. So we're pulling someone out of class and saying, when you get upset, you need to stop, you need to relax, and you need to think. Rather than saying to teachers, please make your own, I took a little bit of time, made a standard one across classes and said, if you're needing to prompt, once again, verbally is probably not going to do a whole lot. And so have this at the ready. Maybe we could gesturally prompt, we could fade to the student using it independently, etc. We're going to talk about task lists and task analysis shortly. Another strategy that I've found very effective to incorporate these things that I've talked about, the circles curriculum or the relationship circles strategy. So as shown here, we're breaking down different levels of people, of the community. We can talk about physical boundaries. You can hug and kiss your family. We should not be trying to hug the mailman, strangers, etc. This also can be very useful for interpersonal sharing of communication. Who, and some of those absolutes that we just talked about. Who can have your social security number? Who can have your phone number, your address? Rather than just either relying on those verbal conversations or assuming this person is 16, they understand this by now. This gives us something to facilitate that sort of conversation. It also gives us a tool to fall back on as needed moving forward. I use this with a student, a kind of an adaptation of this, who was very socially motivated. His challenge was he really couldn't differentiate between positive social attention and negative social attention. So if you find yourself in a room with others and everyone is turning and looking at you, we could think of examples of why you would really want that to be happening. You just got an award, you gave a really good answer. We could think of very specific reasons why that could be your worst case scenario. They're very similar on some sense of, if you can't differentiate those, you may say, I want to have friends, I want to have relationships, but metaphorically, every time you step into the hall for passing time, you're shooting yourself in the foot. And so what we did is we would place peers, we would place other students, not on these categories, but they were levels of contact or setting some boundaries and guidelines of literally the outermost ring was no contact. It was students that I guarantee you he could walk up to and say, I want to give you a $20 bill, and they would tell him to F off because that's where they were at. If you can do that for a week, maybe we can bump it up to not speaking to them, but you could give them a little wave or whatever. That's the sort of thinking that I hope you can take away from this session. Another way to really navigate, especially a bit more reactively, some of those social dynamics, whether it's with peers, teachers, etc., but trying to expose some of that hidden curriculum. The strategy is called comic strip conversations, or sometimes is referred to as cartooning. As it's realistic, this is meant to be an interactive joint process in which both the person as well as the teacher, parent, whomever are giving input and ideas. It is visually oriented. I am not an exceptional artist. Every time I have done this, it has been stick figures in boxes. So the point is not always, or the point is never really to make it visually appealing unless it's something you're going to use over and over. And then maybe you have some sort of minimal standard. Use what you got, focus on why this helps to get the point across. It can be used to teach almost anything. We can use thought bubbles, speaking bubbles. We can color code positive, negative, anxiety, happiness. Using some of those visual elements can help to communicate different parts of what you want to share. This actually is not going to fill in the blank, but I just want to present it to you. If Helen is a peer, if Ron is a teacher, whomever, we're saying things, we're thinking things. Especially if you've worked with students with autism, there's things that have been said or done when you probably could have circled back after class or after the fact and said, here's what you meant, but here's how you said it, or here's what you said, and here's what this made them think. Those are kind of the general things to take away. Excuse me. Comparing them side by side, the social narratives are a bit more addressing a new situation, new behavior to rehearse for the future. But if you went to the library and it didn't go very well, before you go back, by all means, go this route. Cartooning is used more to analyze in retrospect, after the fact, what's been misunderstood, what happened, why. Once again, let's point out that social cognition, that hidden curriculum. Another visual strategy is graphic organizers, which can take multiple shapes depending on the reason. Here's one that I found myself doing probably about weekly, especially with my high school students. So the age-old, why do I have to do this? This is dumb. I'm never going to use this. This is a waste of my time. I have something else to do today. I lost it. Okay, whatever the reason is, there's multiple reasonings and options that you have. And at this point, we're putting all of the cards on the table. That's a non-literal phrase of speech. I do have a table. I don't have any cards. But if you're trying to consider why do you have to do it, you have multiple options. And I'm not going to say whether they're good or bad at this point. So option one is you suck it up and you do it. Option two is you ask for help from me, from your parents, etc. Option three, you could cheat. You could try to copy someone. We'll come back to that though. And option four, you could blow it off, but that has ramifications as well. Now that those things are on the table, let's go back and let's think of some of the cause and effect, especially some of those long-term consequences that for all adolescents, but especially for those with autism, ADHD, putting the cart before the horse, trading the short term for the long term. This is what we're trying to point out, but also at the end of the day, I would leave them with, this is your choice to make. I'm not telling you which to do. I'm not picking for you. I'm not doing your assignment. My job is to give you support. Your job is to navigate this and then hopefully learn from the consequences of that, either good or bad. So we would talk through some of those options to give you some other ways this can be used. These are going to pull just a couple of examples, photographs from the book that I reference here. I'd also shout out the work of Michelle Garcia Winner and social behavior mapping. That's another thing you might be interested in. But similar to the last one, we can put whatever problem in the middle. Let's, think about some different options, but why are some better than others? What are some of the cause and effect? Further, I like how these ones on the left provide language support while still fostering that self-determination. So we kind of have the sentence starter, the sentence template, but we're also we're giving the student hopefully a very unbiased, a very neutral way to share their thoughts, feelings, perspectives, etc. So that could be emotional. Once again, this ties back to that interoceptive piece. Whether you're frustrated, someone who maybe is nonverbal or very significantly limited in their communication, if they're not feeling well, obviously we want to support them. That can be a really challenging circumstance. So we want, in order to provide them what they need in the nurse's office, we need to have a way for them to say, this is what's happening, here's what I need, etc. We can't always just expect that verbally or otherwise that will be conducive. Finally, on the right-hand side here, I like this one for how, this is kind of like the example I shared with the assignment. I like how this one points out the cause and effect, and we still have that unbiased kind of positive negative route, but it very clearly points out, like, no matter what you do, no matter what route you go, this is still where you're planning to end up. So that's a pretty higher level skill, especially if someone's upset. That's going to take a decent amount of inhibition, but that if they can grasp it, that ability of like, yeah, I put in a lot of work to get down here, when hopefully if we can just start taking that upper route to begin with, it would kind of save us all a lot of energy and time, and, you know, we'll leave it at that. Finally, visual schedules. And so I'm going to talk about this in conjunction with task analysis, because in some ways they are similar, but across the board, whether you are in early childhood, high school, transition, you know, cognitively impaired, twice exceptional, when you're creating a visual schedule, think about how it's going to be represented, how much time it's going to cover, how are we going to update or manipulate it, where will it be found, and who's going to kind of drive it. Is it going to be more adult driven, or are we really trying to promote someone setting up this sort of system independently in their life? So on a very short time frame or schedule, that's more of this task analysis. You know, every restroom you go into nowadays, especially with COVID, has that step-by-step process of, here's how we want you to wash your hands. Once again, we can break down very simple functional behaviors. We can break down very complex behaviors. But for any of you that have tried to learn a new skill, I know I wear a tie infrequently enough that any wedding that comes up, I got to go to YouTube and put in how to tie a tie. So either I'm looking up some form of pictorial and textual task analysis, or it's not in this session, but a video model of not only having the process, but that video demonstration further emphasizes some of these roads we're going down. So whether it's that very short time scale, the whole day, any of you that have a personal or professional planner, calendar, you are scheduling, you are task analyzing your life, you are providing a visual support so that you don't have to remember 3 weeks from now that you need to be here and there. This is a concrete cue. Hopefully I'm normalizing many of these things that, once again, anyone benefits from. Some are more impacted by not having these sort of supports to fall back on. The last thing I want to point out in this slide before we touch on resources and wrap up with any discussions and questions, I want to talk about how you could align, especially looking at this task analysis, into the daily visual schedule. If you Google visual schedule, especially if you throw autism or ADHD on there, you're going to find something like this. That's for, in my opinion, a young / more cognitively impaired / bordering on, like, do you still use Microsoft 95? We can take these things outside of those contexts. We can put them in our community. We can put them on the job. We can make it conducive to a high school student using a very similar full underlying philosophy and even look. But I think hopefully you understand why, if I put what's up here in the middle in my setting 3 high school special education class, I may have some students that I'm going to lose some buy-in and some credibility with. But let's say this schedule is very applicable to my classroom, and I have 12 students in my class. 10 of them, this is enough to know where we're heading with our day, what's coming next, when is recess, etc. But if I have 2, even 1 student who every day I have to verbally gesture, prompt, model, hey, go to your cubby, take off your coat, hang up your backpack, bring your favorite fidget to the circle. What does unpack mean? I just broke it down into multiple steps. Sometimes, and I can't guarantee this is not all the time, if you give someone a directive and they don't initiate, sometimes it is non-compliance or willfully choosing not to. Sometimes it's, I don't know how to do that. I know where you want me to end, but I don't know where you want me to begin. I know the first step, but I don't know the second step. Sometimes we have to unpack what unpack actually means. And so because every day that student walks into my classroom, it is worth my 5-10 minutes, not for washing my hands, but to create something like this so that as they walk in the door, I can say, hey, glad you're here. Here is your visual task analysis. Please go unpack. And that's how we are promoting some of that independence while also providing that support. If I can fade my support from verbal, gestural, as I pointed out, if I can take myself as a person out of the equation, then that means I could go support another student. I could do something else. I'm sure there's many other things just like this that are well worth my time as an educator. Lastly, I'm going to end on this. This is an example that hopefully will tie a lot of this together in some ways as well. It's also something that I will take credit for in the sense of I put it together, I developed it, I made the PDF. But as I described, basically what I did is took all of the things I just talked to you about, thought about it, and then aligned that with a student and the goals they were working on. So this was a student who I first met, I believe, as an 8th grader. Upon originally meeting under my case management, I would estimate his language arts skills, i.e. his ability to read and his ability to write were probably somewhere between the 1st and 2nd grade levels. So we have a very significant gap between chronological age and where we would hope him to be, or where he is in comparison to many of his peers. A few other things to point out are that this student verbally is much higher. So from a language standpoint, the written language, the writing, the reading, significant, staggered, splintered abilities. Verbally, he's actually pretty witty. Sometimes he's verbose. He's that one that's like, he's not short of words, especially if you're talking about something he's interested in. Probably as a product of that, amongst other things, and probably not as you wouldn't expect, he had developed a decent aversion to doing those 2 tasks, reading or writing, in the sense of whether you're at home, in the community, especially at school, if I as a teacher am going to sit the student down and say, I want you to read this, I'm not going to have a lot of buy-in. I'm potentially going to get resistance. And so here's the process that we went down, while also being realistic that, like, we're talking about the scope of like an IEP year, right? I don't want you to get the impression that 2 weeks later we were where we wanted to be. Like, this was putting in work on a weekly basis to grind away. But we made a couple years worth of progress in maybe a year and a half. We were doing what we were supposed to. And so to address that goal of increasing the written, but we also could connect this to reading pretty easily. few things I did. I refer to this as a task analyzed graphic organizer for writing a 5-sentence paragraph. So I've taken the process that most students would go through in order to develop a 5-paragraph sentence, which we also know is the basis of them moving on to a 5-paragraph essay. And so a couple things that I would do, at least starting out until we got some momentum, some buy-in, and then maybe I look to go every other, I'd always let him choose the topic. I'm not going to give a topic that he doesn't care about, that he doesn't know anything about, and say, let's write and read about it. So I'd say, and once again, this is incorporating that choice. The mutual shared outcome is, I want you to read, I want you to write. To get that going, I need to kind of be willing to be flexible and say, I'm not going to choose what we're reading and writing about. The other choice that I would allow him to make is, do you want to write for the left-hand column or the right-hand column? And as you can very clearly see, the left-hand column is significantly less work than the right-hand column. But once again, just like with choosing the topic, my goal isn't to go from writing 0 words a week to writing a paragraph. My goal is to go from writing 0 words a week to a minimum of 4 words every time we can do this activity, right? And so as we're brainstorming, topic was usually a graphic novel, a video game, some combination of the two. The topic is Batman. All right, let's write that down so we don't have to remember it. We can take it off of our working memory. What's a detail about Batman? He lives in Gotham City. Okay, write down Gotham City. Hopefully you can get 2 words rather than 1 out of that box. He's got a cool suit. Oh, sweet, 2 more words. The percentage is flying through the roof. Once we do that, now we circle back, and this is where we can work on how do we flesh a topic into a topic sentence. And like I said, this student verbally was much further ahead. So if I'm scribing, he could pretty easily take the idea of Batman and say, put Batman in a sentence. So this is where we start to chip away. And like I said, it was not quick by any means. It was chipping away, but we were able to make some significant progress. And the thing I'll end on before I review a couple of resources is, it's not that he wasn't able to produce a 5-sentence paragraph. It's the way that I, or most people typically would go about doing so, is asking him to do that while also do all of these other things. Whether that is write a 5-sentence paragraph while also holding a topic and 3 details in your mind. Or write a 5-sentence paragraph while also ignoring the sensory distractions of the people around you and the HVAC unit that keeps kicking in, which is beyond our control. If we can separate some of those tasks, which we can't always do, and it does take a lot of work on the front end, but whether it's unpacking for the day, whether it's writing a 5-sentence paragraph, there are specific tasks, routines, etc., that we do frequently enough that it's worth that investment of time. And even more so, they're the things that, yes, we want people to be successful within the school day, whether that's in the building or currently at home. We also have a broader goal of those skills that are generalized or transcendent to be able to be applicable outside of those contexts as well. So we have 15 minutes left. If you are interested in that guide to evidence-based practices, some of the other things that team out of UNC has available, these are a few links to get you started. And specifically, They are one of multiple entities that does have some supports COVID specific. So in a sense of, it's a great place to start to not always reinvent the wheel outright. I can't guarantee or promise what's available any one place, but it's like, if you need a task analysis or a social narrative for things like wearing a mask, social distancing, there are some entities that I'm pointing out here that have taken some time. So on a general, broad sense, like I said, we all don't have to do it independent of one another, but that doesn't mean it's going to be effective for any specific individual. We have done something similar, so I'd encourage you once again, if ASM is new to you, if you want to see some of the other things that we do or have coming up, visit our website generally, ausm.org, but we also have compiled a number of COVID-specific resources that are a bit more localized to the state of Minnesota. The National PBIS website has done very similar efforts. And if you're familiar, if you're in special ed and you've ever done the STAR program, they, one, have an online learning system called SOLS, S-O-L-S. Feel free to reach out to me. There's some money and resources available to get that going without investment monetarily in schools. They also have put out, this is a great example of, if you go here, there's some general templates for things like schedules, token economies, etc. So not going to work for everyone, but also we can't reinvent all of these things every time we want to use them. So we got to work together in that sense. I just put my email in the chat. You are welcome to reach out to me individually with this time left via the chat, or if you're brave enough to unmute or even start your video. I'm happy to take any questions you may have. I'll start out, there was one that came in. What would be an adaptation for a student who does a verbal stim during classroom time that is distracting to other students? Great question. This is an example of where we're gonna, at least starting out, we're gonna look to shape this behavior versus just trying to extinguish it or eliminate it. So different ways we can do so. I haven't met this student, so there's a number of questions that I would follow up with if we were in person or on a more individual level. But to give you some directions to go or some guidance, think about that idea of setting a boundary of when and where this verbal stim is and isn't appropriate. So we can teach that via social narrative. We can teach that via social behavior mapping. But once again, the idea isn't to eliminate this. Let's try to be more predictable, more specific, more concrete in, if the goal is for the student to not do it during this class time, where are you directing them to do it? If you're telling someone what not to do, what are they supposed to do instead, both within that moment, in addition to, like I said, on some level, this student may need to do this stim one time or another, at least, moving forward over the next 6 to 12 months, we'll say. And so the other things we can do, that's working more individual focused, that's very relevant and worthwhile, more environmental or going the other route. As needed, we can try to minimize this. But I also think you would agree, we don't want this student to do it once and then be like, all right, you're out of here. So how can we work with other students to understand this is going to happen from time to time? This person's working on it. If it's becoming a distraction, if it's getting annoying, we have headphones available. You could move to a different area of the classroom or even another space within, so let's not rely on any one specific strategy, but by thinking about it those ways, if we can even take 2 or 3 of those things and kind of get them going, once again, you're not going to tomorrow eliminate this from happening. But I bet you over the course of, weeks to, if you put in some work, hopefully you'll at least see a decrease, or when it does occur, you have some tools to fall back on, or kind of the ramifications of it don't become as disruptive to the learning environment. But once again, great question, and hopefully that encourages others of you to use this time that's available. If you do have other questions, if you want to private chat me, you are able via the blue box instead of everyone. If you want to find, I am listed as the host or Eric. If you want to send it to me privately, I am happy to paraphrase in order to get it to me without putting it out there to everyone. So I'm going to stick around for at least a couple more minutes here, but if you are done or you've gotten what you needed, thank you for your time. Hopefully we can cross paths again, or you can seek out other opportunities via Awesome, and be well and take care. Thank you.